and how values can change depending on the community that you are in.
First as a Black woman, and then as a defense attorney.
You care about defending.
Fair cross-section because there's an obvious group of people, that distinct group that is loose, that is missing.
That language that you should be using, because that's what the law says.
Currently, because of the overwhelming media coverage, any potential juror may have already formed an opinion about the case.
Members of the jury, I'm here, you're here, Porsha-Shaf'on is here. Welcome to our February conversation, Jury Duty Unmasked. Porsha-Shaf'on, how you doing?
I'm holding steady, doing what I do when I can. How are you?
I'm doing well. Had a little bit of travel today and happy to share a little bit about where I am, but I want to know, where are you? Because you're not in the Boogie Down Bronx at the moment, right?
I am not, but I'll still throw my X's up. I am in the great state of Colorado. I am in Denver, to be exact. The Juror Project has come to Denver to train lawyers about, how to be good lawyers, on cross-examination, on, how to pick jurors. Y'all out there in the community, we don't just talk to y'all, we try to teach them how to talk to y'all as well.
I love that. And I'm not in New Orleans. I'm actually in Oakland, California at the moment, giving a presentation with the Contra Costa Public Defender's Office. Going to be talking to them about how we can facilitate this constitutional right of selecting a jury from a fair cross-section. You all might be familiar with this concept that the Sixth Amendment gives this idea that you have a right to have an impartial jury. And what that means is that your jury shouldn't be biased one way or the other. And that impartiality, that fairness, that lack of bias is actually secured through having a fair cross-section of your community to select your jury from. So I'm really excited to be hanging out with the public defenders at the Contra Costa office tomorrow. But tonight we are going to be having a conversation about some things that are a little bit current in today's world, right? We're going to be looking at what's been happening in Minnesota as it relates to people being killed at the hands of ICE. We're going to be looking at what are possibilities of accountability, but then also exploring how are people who are demonstrating and resisting the presence of ICE, how are they being charged and what are they being charged with? But before we dive into that, I just want to remind folks who we are. So we are the Juror Project, and we are committed to facilitating and curating juries that look like the communities where these trials are taking place. There's three different things that we try to do. One, we're trying to improve diversity of jury panels. And when we talk about jury diversity, we do mean diversity of race, and we also mean diversity of perspective, diversity of age, diversity in every sense of the word, because the research is really clear. When we have more diverse juries, when we have juries that look like our communities where these trials are taking place, we actually have more fairness. The second thing that we do is we're trying to improve people's perspective of jury duty, right? We want to make sure when people get that jury summons in the mail, they're excited to serve, they're excited to flex that power. And then the third thing, we are trying to arm the community with the power of serving on a jury. And sometimes we like to describe our work as trying to create a justice system that is worthy of that name. And some of the ways in which we do this work is we give conversations and presentations in the community. Sometimes we're meeting with lawyers like we're doing right now. Porsha-Shaf'on is in Denver, I'm in Oakland, and we're trying to ensure that the people who are tasked with selecting the jury and representing the community know how to do it through a lens of fairness and equity. Porsha-Shaf'on, can you tell us a little bit, why do we do these Instagram lives?
So we do these Instagram lives because we believed, right, that, one of the best things about being, why am I tongue-tied, Will? Why am I tongue-tied?
Like, I blame the altitude.
An amazing juror is an informed juror. For lack of a better word, we really think that it's important not just to talk to you about the importance of jury service, but also to arm you with the necessary information to really get in there and do your duty. We don't just mean jury duty is our duty as a euphemism. We mean it in all ways. It's not just about, talking at you to engage in jury service. It's also about informing you why your presence is so powerful and why your voice is so valuable.
Thanks
if
for
I
that.
could speak English, we would be able to do this right.
You're good. You're good. I want to bring three names into the conversation, right? Keith Porter, somebody
Yeah.
who was celebrating the new year, and the story goes that he was shooting his gun in the air on New Year's Eve, bringing in the new year, which is potentially an arrestable offense in Los Angeles. And there is an off-duty ICE agent who is in their apartment, hears the gunshots going off, and could have called the police, right? ICE officers are trained to, enforce immigration laws, not local county laws or state laws. But instead of calling the police, who are trained to interact with people who might have a gun, or even if there's like a mass shooter situation going on, like local police department has that training for those types of interventions. This off-duty ICE agent approaches Keith Porter and shoots and kills him, right? No process, no arrest, no inquiry, just shoots and kills Keith Porter. And we think about, what's has happened in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities with Renee Good and Alex Preddy, again, interacting between the community and ICE agents, and two people dying at the hands of ICE agents in Minneapolis. And then after that, we have seen, and I went to school at University of Minnesota, we have seen the Minneapolis community take to the streets to demonstrate their opposition to how the federal government is occupying the streets of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and how they're bringing community harm that they haven't seen before at the hands of the federal government. And there was a demonstration at a church in St. Paul. And Porsha-Shaf'on, do you remember why they selected that church for that demonstration?
Yes. So there is a pastor in the church. I believe his last name is Eastwood, or I believe it's Eastwood. That pastor is said to be the head of one of the ICE offices in Minneapolis. In fact, I think it may be in 2024. There are photos all over the internet of him posted up with Kristi Noem. And so, yeah, they chose that church specifically because the pastor of that church is head of one of the ICE offices in Minneapolis.
We saw some video and heard some news as it related to at least two journalists and community organizers who have been arrested and charged in relation to the demonstration that took place at that church. A lot of people are familiar with Don Lemon. And then there was another, Georgia Forte, I believe is her name, was also charged by a grand jury. Walk us through, remind me of that process. How does a grand jury play a role in deciding an indictment or a charge? And then after you kind of give us that insight, I want to talk to you to teach us a little bit about like what specifically they're charged with.
Sure. So, for our community members who are not lawyers, the grand jury is the way in which a case moves forward. So, the grand jury are really just community members who are sitting in a room listening to the evidence that the prosecutor is presenting. I want to be very clear that a grand jury is different from a trial jury. The grand jury is really the first line of defense that could protect us in the community from unjust prosecutions. The grand jury are community members, and for days and weeks, they are solely listening more often than not to the prosecutors and police present evidence as to why a case should move forward, or put a different way, why there is enough evidence for a case to move forward. It is vital to note that the grand jury is a secret proceeding. The individual that has been arrested and accused of the crime is not present, nor is his lawyer. The members of the grand jury, I'm sorry, Will.
No, I just wanted to get clarity around that. So Don Lemon or Georgia Forte or any of the activists or organizers who were listed in this indictment, they weren't actually part of that proceeding when they were indicted. It's not like an adversarial process.
Not at all. And that's a huge difference between a trial jury and a grand jury. So, in order for a case to proceed, the prosecution puts forth evidence before community members. Those community members listen to the evidence and they make a decision. Yes, there's enough information to go forward. No, there's not enough information to go forward. If the community members decide, yes, there is enough information to go forward, it's called a true bill has been voted. If the community members decide absolutely not, there's not enough information to go forward, then a no true bill is put forth. And it is important to note that once this no true bill is voted, the case is over. If they want to bring the case back, they have to figure out a different way.
Thanks for that. So what I'm hearing is there's a difference between a grand jury and a trial jury. A grand jury is essentially tasked with deciding whether or not charges should be formally brought against an individual, whereas a trial jury, they're in a position where charges have been brought and now they're voting on, do we vote guilty or not guilty? Did I get that right?
You did get that right. But I do want to note for community members, in both instances, you can change somebody's life. And you'll often hear me say that. And if you've listened to our lives in the past, sitting on a jury is a vital, vital service to our communities. Because if you are sitting on a grand jury as a community member, it is your job to interrogate, right? Whether or not the police did what they were supposed to do in effectuating this arrest, right? And we hear about this all the time, right? Our uncle's mother's cousin, sister's brother was just walking down the street, and they come home and they tell us how the police officers hopped out of their car, right? For no reason except to harass them. So community members, when you are out there, if you do get selected to sit on a grand jury, I really want you to listen closely and think about what the witnesses, what the prosecutor is presenting to you as enough evidence to move these cases forward.
Is there a threshold that the prosecutor has to meet to kind of satisfy when they're in this grand jury stage and they're presenting their case for an indictment?
Yeah, so there are two different things, right? So in a grand jury, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it is preponderance of evidence. It is essentially the bar is
probable cause.
Probable cause. I apologize. That there's probable cause for the arrest, right? And let me take a step back for community members as well. In order for police officers to arrest you, they must have probable cause. Now, what that means in plain language is that there is a fair probability that you are the person that committed the crime. When police officers search you, it's supposed to be a fair probability that what they're searching contains evidence of a crime. And so when the prosecutors and police are before you, community members, I want you to have that in your head when you're thinking about whether or not to move a case forward, or whether or not you decide there is enough evidence to charge this person with the crime.
So here, people have been indicted. And before I get into what they were indicted for, why are we having this conversation, right? We're putting so much emphasis on the power and the importance of a grand jury. And here there's been a grand jury that received information about the case from the federal prosecutors, and they voted to indict the person. So what more should we be expecting in this type of a scenario?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think people get confused about when thinking about the difference between a grand jury and a trial jury is the bar to indict someone is far lower than the bar to convict someone and take away their liberty, right? And the reason that the bar is lower is because in a grand jury, the only decision that is being made is whether or not there's enough information to move forward with the case. When you are taking away someone's liberty, right? The trial jury has to decide that there is enough information. The prosecutor has met their burden. They have satisfied every single element of every single crime that the grand jurors have decided should move forward. And if a trial jury has decided that there is enough information, that the prosecutor has met their burden, then someone's liberty can be taken away. But in both instances, community members are in a position to change someone's life.
Thanks for that clarification. And I'm thinking through, how often is there conversations between the criminal legal system and the community as it relates to what the options are in a grand jury room? And sometimes I have concerns about the appearance of authority of prosecutors and the willingness of community to follow the lead of prosecutors. And
you should have that concern,
right? And saying, when the prosecutor is asking the community, hey, we're bringing these charges, sometimes I can think there can be scenarios where there's more deference that's given to federal prosecutors, and saying, if I'm a grand juror, I'm saying, okay, well, this federal prosecutor has been elected or appointed to do this job, and we don't have any reason to believe that they're not doing their job ethically or faithfully. Yeah, of course, you're saying that you're bringing charges. We're good with that. Are there any concerns that we should be flagging here?
There are so many concerns. And sort of in everything you said, you're so graceful. That is, you give so much grace. That is exactly what is happening, right? I mean, someone comes into a room with their suit and tie on, looking official tissue. They are flanked, right, by a police officer in their uniform, right? It all looks official, right? They're using all of this legalese in that room, right? And it looks and it feels like something that now it looks and feels as if I should be doing what these people are saying, right? They're literally coming into this room under the guise of protecting my rights and protecting the larger community. So why would they lie, right? Like, why would they have an ulterior motive but to be protecting me and by extension my community? And we should absolutely be thinking these are human beings just like us, with biases, and experiences and motives for why they want to, seek indictments for certain people, seek indictments for certain crimes, seek indictments in certain parts of the country, right? We should all, as community members who are charged with the duty of protecting each other, really be thinking more intentionally about why prosecutors are bringing these charges against certain people in certain places.
You mentioned this term motive. Like, what is the motive? And I want to just take a minute for the folks tuning in to understand the motive in this moment in our country that is very different than motives we've seen in the past, right? Our Department of Justice has become a prosecutorial arm of the White House. And there are politically motivated prosecutions that are happening right now. And so we're in a moment where we need to be questioning the motive of certain prosecutions, because they may not be motivated by trying to, enforce laws that have been voted upon to promote public safety, but they might be motivated by a different agenda, a political agenda that is not consistent with keeping all people in our country safe, but is more consistent and concerned with advancing agenda for a particular political slant one way or the other. So with that in mind, we know at least two individuals that were covering the demonstration in the church were journalists, and they were charged with something called the FACE Act and the Klan Act, or the enforcement, I forgot the full name of it, but can you break down for us what is the FACE Act and what is this Klan Act?
Okay. So the first one I think we should talk about is the Klan Act. Okay. And the Klan Act is the older act because it was enacted in 1871, I believe. And the purpose of the Klan Act, which was utilized by, I believe it was President Ulysses Grant in 1871. The purpose of the Klan Act was to protect Black people, newly freed Black people. This is a, Reconstruction era law that was enacted to protect Black people that were being intimidated and terrorized by the Ku Klux Klan. And and we can think of multiple instances, right, where this occurred. When Black people were trying to exercise their right to vote, when Black people were moving into certain neighborhoods, when Black people were trying to protest in an effort, to claim some of these rights that they're being promised as newly freed and formerly enslaved individuals, right? And this act allowed the federal government to arrest and go into communities where the local government officials were not protecting their citizens. I want y'all to think Alabama, Black people trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, right? And the fact that, oftentimes members of the police force, government officials were all members of the Ku Klux Klan. And the federal government realized that the local government, local officials were not protecting the Black people in their communities. And so this law was enacted as an effort to protect individuals around the country that were not protected locally.
Porsha-Shaf'on, you're making me think of a book called Freakonomics. And I read this book many, many years ago.
Yep.
And in this book, it actually references kind of coded ways in which Klan members would ask a question to try to identify if the person they were engaging with were another Klan member. So one of the questions that they would ask is, do you know a Mr. Mr. Ayak, A-Y-A-K? And A-Y-A-K stood for, are you a Klansman? And then the person would respond, no, I don't know Mr. Ayak, but I know Mr. Akia, A-K-I-A, a Klansman I am, right? So when we're thinking about this Ku Klux Klan Act, right, it was recognizing, as you mentioned, that within the local law enforcement, within the local government, right, there were members of the Ku Klux Klan. And think about those times where we had these racial terror lynchings in our country, where somebody would be arrested, a Black person would be arrested, they would be brought to a jail. You know what jails are designed to do? To keep people locked in. And simultaneously, that means if you are being locked in, people aren't going to be able to break you out. But what will we see all the time? These local law enforcement officers who were Klansmen themselves, they would just kind of turn the other way, hand the key while they would come in, break into jail, take that Black person out, and commit that racial terror lynching. So we're thinking about this environment where the federal government had to step in because local governments were not doing a good job of protecting their own. And now in 2026, we're having this different dynamic, right? We have federal government coming into state government, into state jurisdictions, doing things that are not consistent with what the state jurisdiction wants. So thanks for that background on the Klan law, the KKK Act. Anything you want to add before you give us a little bit about the history of the FACE Act?
One thing that I want to add about the Klan Act historically is that was piece number one of the act, right? Or piece number one of the law, which was that it allowed the federal government to go into states in an effort to protect Black people when local officials were not. The other thing that I think is important to note is that the other part of the act or portion of the act actually made these government officials liable to the federal government. These local government officials that were failing to protect its citizens could also become liable to the federal government for failing to do this. And we may touch upon this, time, if we have time, but, this Klan Act was what was essentially called a zombie act, right? So even though it had not been repealed or anything, it had been a long time since it's been used. And I can give some examples later on, like more recent situations where it's been used separate and apart from what's been happening in Minneapolis. But this act is from the 1870s, and it's been a long time since it's been used at all. But of course, one thing they're going to do is try to figure out and dust off more ways to disenfranchise us.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier there's these two laws that are kind of being utilized in tandem with these charges, with these indictments. So you have the Klan Act and you have the FACE Act. And while you're teeing up to tell us a little bit about the FACE Act, I want to remind people hit us with some questions. Like if you have questions about either of these acts or anything that we are discussing, definitely let us know in the comments and we'll answer your question. So Porsha-Shaf'on, give us a little bit of background about the FACE Act.
Absolutely. So the FACE Act, just so community members know, is also an old law, but it's from the 1990s. It actually was, I believe, enacted in 1994. And it stands for the Freedom of Access to Clinical Entrances Act. And really what it's designed to do is protect people who are trying to exercise their right of religious freedom in religious spaces or spaces that are used for religious reasons. Protect those individuals and protect those places from intimidation and violence. It's also been used to protect people who are trying this in places that provide reproductive services. And so in 1994, like I said, it was definitely enacted to do just that. But just like the KKK Act, it has been a long time since it's been used, and they've dusted this baby off to figure out a new way to disenfranchise us.
So in the 90s, there's attacks that are happening in very violent ways on clinics that are providing access to reproductive health care. And there's also churches that are being terrorized, and people who are trying to enter their places of worship are being interfered with. And a lot of those churches were historically Black churches. Now in 2026, we're seeing some of these laws that were kind of emerging out of intentions to protect the Black community, or intentions of protecting people accessing reproductive health care, or intentions behind ensuring that local Klansmen aren't disregarding people's civil rights. That's not how these laws are being applied today. What is it about the KKK Act and the FACE Act that are being used today to charge the folks in St. Paul who were at that church?
So with respect to the Klan Act, essentially what they're trying to say is the protesters in Minneapolis are trying to intimidate the ICE agents and any officials, by extension of ICE agents, from doing their job, or from and by doing their job, taking people out of their community and putting them in detention centers and deporting them without due process. So they're saying that these protesters are going beyond peaceful protests, and they are becoming violent, and they're using either force or threat of force to not allow, and just only talking about the Klan Act, but also sort of tacking on the FACE Act as well. And the reason that, and I want to be clear, the FACE Act has only been attached to the indictment that includes those individuals that went into the church at the end of January of this year. The KKK Act has been used just in and of itself over the last few years for different reasons. So the Klan Act and the FACE Act being used together, the only instance that we see in this moment right now is was used to indict the protesters who went into the church in Minneapolis. But the Klan Act alone is also being used to attack protesters who they believe are trying to stop ICE from doing their job.
Got it. We have a question about the DOJ, which I want to get to in a second. But before we do, I keep mentioning that two of the individuals who have been charged are journalists. And think about the First Amendment, right? There's 5 things that are protected in the First Amendment: freedom of religion, assembly, religion, association, petition, press, freedom of speech. The freedom of the press, right? They have this ability to document, to report, to convey news, things that are happening. Why is that significant when we're recognizing that 2 of the individuals that have been charged in the indictment were in fact journalists?
So I want to note something that an official from the DOJ said. Just speaking specifically with respect to Don Lemon and his indictment, they're essentially saying that Don Lemon knew that there was going to be a violent protest in this church. And he is trying to cloak himself with stating that he was there as a journalist, and as a journalist, he had a right to be there to cover what was happening. And the DOJ is simply saying that is BS. You were there as a protester. You knew things were going to get violent, and you were there to participate in the violence. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'll go after you.
So, I really, really, really think it's important to note for individuals out there who did not see the video of what happened in this church, the DOJ is trying to couch the protesters' physical presence in the church as an act of intimidation and as an act of violence. I want to note that the individuals that were there to protest did not incite any violence. And in fact, if you take the time to watch the video of what was happening in that church, at least one of the many videos, the protesters were saying chants like, "Hands up, don't shoot," and "This is what community looks like." Those are two of the most consistent protest chants that were being said inside of the church. So I do want to note these things because language matters, right? Mm-hmm. The government is calling people or characterizing people all across the country that are bucking up against them. They're characterizing them as violence. And I just want to contextualize what is actually happening because language does matter.
I got questions for you, Porsha-Shaf'on, but we have questions that are coming in, and I need to start getting to them.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to take the first question, and then there's a second question about jury nullification that I'd like you to take. So the first question we have is, what reforms would you prioritize over the next 2 to 5 years to repair/rebuild/prevent further weaponization of the Department of Justice? The reform that I want to see in the next 2 to 5 years that addresses ability to repair, rebuild, or prevent further weaponization of the Department of Justice is really looking at this practice of prosecutors, federal prosecutors, seeking indictments from a grand jury more than one time. And what we have seen in Illinois, in DC, in Minnesota, and in California, where federal prosecutors assemble a grand jury. And remember, as Porsha-Shaf'on shared with us, the purpose of a grand jury is for the community to review a presentation of a case solely by the prosecutor. The person who is potentially being indicted doesn't voice any presentation to the grand jury, but the grand jury and the assembled community is going to receive a presentation of a case from a prosecutor, and then they decide whether or not there are probable cause for the charges that are being requested by the prosecutor, and they can vote no true bill. And when they vote no true bill, that means no indictment. A reform that I want to see is to combat this practice of federal prosecutors re-impaneling grand jurors when they don't get an indictment. So what that looks like is if a grand jury is assembled and a prosecutor doesn't get an indictment, before they can convene a second grand jury to try to seek an indictment again, they got to have good cause. They got to have new evidence. They have to have new information, because if they're just presenting the same information that they presented to the first grand jury, then you're just doing forum shopping. And I think that is unconstitutional. And that's one of the reforms that I'd like to see in the next 2 to 5 years.
Yeah, actually, Will, I'll leave it at that. You're spot on.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to send this next question to you. It says, if jury nullification becomes more common in response to politicization, does that protect democracy or become co-opted and then become yet another way to destabilize the rule of law? And before you answer that question, can you just remind us what is jury nullification?
Absolutely. So for those of you that are new to this, and for those of you that are true to this and already know, jury nullification is when individuals that are sitting on a jury listen to the evidence, and even if the prosecutor has done their job, which is proven every element of every crime, or they have, in the case of a grand jury, presented evidence that supports that there was probable cause for the arrest, the jury in a grand jury decides no true bill anyway, and a trial jury decides to acquit. So essentially, even if the prosecutor has satisfied every element of every crime charge, the community members say, so what? And they acquit the person. In a grand jury, if the prosecutor puts forth police testimony that says, sure, there's enough evidence for the case to go forward, the community members in the grand jury still decide a no true bill.
Thanks for that. So we can have different forms of nullification. Nullification can look like when a prosecutor is seeking to charge somebody with a crime, the grand jury can say, no, we don't want to charge this person with a crime. Absolutely. Or in a trial jury, they can say, no, we're not going to be voting guilty for this person. Is that a right that the jury has, or is that a power?
It is a power and it is not a right. So, for example, in the grand jury, if the grand jury votes a no true bill, that's it. Case over. Or as my homegirl says, party over. That's it. The case does not go forward. That means that there's going to be no more court dates. The person is not going to have to go to trial. The case is over at the very beginning.
So what happens if jury nullification becomes more happenstance, or it's becoming more frequent in response to these politically motivated prosecutions? Is that going to be interpreted as a protection of democracy, or do you have any concern that nullification can be co-opted in a way that destabilizes the rule of law?
The question assumes that the rule of law is stable and that that we have engaged in political practices that evince democracy. And if you are Black or brown living in this country, and you know what I know, you know what I mean, the rule of law has not been written with us in mind. In fact, when there are opportunities for us to have, or for us to be able to benefit from certain rules of law, it's always taken away. You know, I struggle, and I'm going to be very transparent with the community that's out there with the idea that these laws are written. If we follow them, everything is going to be okay. Right. And the question assumes that that's the case. Right. As a citizen, I'm doing what I need to do, or I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do. A government official steps in order to handle that. And so the idea that that jury nullification, meaning community members can hear evidence and still decide to stop a case, or hear evidence and decide to allow a community member to go free, says a lot, not just about our community's perspective on democracy, but also about our community's experiences or thoughts on the rule of law. Because at the end of the day, the one thing that I want our community members to remember is when people nullify, it's not for shits and giggles. When the community members nullify, they nullify for several reasons. They nullify because they don't believe in the law, generally. So who cares about the rule of law? When a community member nullifies, they don't believe in the law as it's applied to this case. When they nullify, they often want to send a message to police, to prosecutors about whether or not this is even right. Right? We forget that what happens oftentimes, especially in communities of color, especially in places where people are resisting, we often forget that, you know, they're having a very different experience than other individuals in the country. And so when people have decided, cool, the police did arrest you, maybe he did have some drugs on him, but so what? The price that one has to pay for having that little bit of drugs on him is too high. So go home and you get help, right? And so I struggle with the question a lot, because it really does assume that our police prosecutors and criminal legal system are acting in the ways that they are supposed to?
We sometimes frame or interpret jury nullification as an ability to measure whether or not the values of the governed are still consistent with the laws of the government, right? And when we think about nullification, we get to have conversations about how it can be used both ways, right? When we think about the case involving the murder of Emmett Till, beautiful young Black boy from Chicago visiting family down in Mississippi, and he is accused of whistling or saying something to a white woman at a convenience store. The white woman tells her husband and his brother-in-law and the husband go track down Emmett Till. They, beat him, they drag his body, they mutilate, his body, they kill him. And there was no mystery about who committed that crime of murder. And those two individuals who killed Emmett Till were tried by an all-white, all-male jury, and they voted not guilty. That was an act of jury nullification. So I appreciate the question to remind us that there have been instances in our country where nullification has potentially been used not to promote fairness for the community, not to send a message of what type of behavior we think should not be allowed, but to condone acts of terror and acts of violence against the Black community. I will say in 2026, where we are seeing nullification happen more often than not are going to be in simple possession of drug cases, or in cases that might involve interactions of the police that proceeded in an investigation in a racist or improper way, right? They're so much more confined to circumstances of individual cases that for me, it reduces my fear of nullification being co-opted for a tool to destabilize the rule of law. And I think the rule of law might be an ideal that we have been introduced to as it relates to everybody being able to live in a safe community, having investments and ability in our community to thrive. But that ideal and that idea is not always the experience and the practice that people have in our country. The third question that we have been able to receive, and please keep the questions coming, we do appreciate them. The next question is, as prosecutorial power becomes more and more politicized, what role do jurors realistically play as a final democratic safeguard? And I think this ties right into the conversation of nullification. But before I pass it for you to chime in a little bit more, Porsha-Shaf'on, I want to remind people, when the framers drafted the Constitution, right? I love, whenever I get to bring this into one of our lives, I do, right? When I think about how they loved the right of the jury trial, right? I describe it as the right so nice, they named it twice, because in our Constitution, the right to a jury trial is in Article 3, Section 2, and it is in the Sixth Amendment, right? When we're talking about criminal jury trials, we have these two reference points. And that is because the framers of the Constitution knew far too well the tyranny of a king. And when we have a tyrannical king who is trying to infringe upon the rights of its people that is supposed to be governing, we have to rely on the people of being that final safeguard, that final defense mechanism to prevent a tyrannical government from ruling over its people in an unjust way. So when I'm thinking about how prosecutorial power becomes more and more politicized, I can't help but remind us about the intentions that the framers probably had to position the people to be a check on the government, to be a check on the executive branch for not essentially enforcing laws that have no business being enforced. What are your thoughts?
So, this question, prosecutions are always politicized. For those of you that watch Law and Order, right? And every single time a new DA is running for election, right? That determines the types of prosecutions that are happening more often, right? If the prosecutor's platform is drugs, you're going to see a significant amount of young Black and brown boys rounded up and incarcerated, right? So prosecutions are always politicized. And the role of the jurors, AKA the community members, is to put a check on it. What happens more often than not is police officers go into communities and they use their discretion to make arrests and, treat the community how they want. Those cases then go to prosecutors, and prosecutors make decisions based on their symbiotic relationships with police. And then after the prosecution makes the decisions to bring those cases forward, they bring it to grand juries, right? And you, as a community member in the grand jury, can make a decision that, look, this case doesn't belong in the grand jury, or this police officer, despite what they're telling me, is not doing what they need to do. Or prosecutor, we know that you and your minions have alternative reasons for bringing this case, and we're going to shut this shit down. Now, if a case slips through the cracks and it makes it to a trial jury, the trial jury is armed with the same duty, right? To really listen and interrogate not just the evidence before you, but the reason why. And so as community members, you truly can act as a real check on government tyranny.
Thanks for that, Porsha-Shaf'on. I want to transition to the month of February.
Hey!
We are in Black History Month, and I want to, just give a little backdrop as it relates to some pioneer Black people who have been written down in history as some of the first Black jurors in our country. We all are familiar with what are sometimes described as like the Civil Rights Amendments or the Reconstruction Amendments. And when people use those terms, typically what they are referring to are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Now, the 13th Amendment, as we all know, abolishes slavery with the exception for criminal punishment. The 14th Amendment gives us concepts of due process and equal protection. And the 15th Amendment gives us this practice of, authority of Black male suffrage, or giving Black men the right to vote. Women don't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment, and it's ratified, I believe, in 1920. So we have some names of people who were some of the first Black jurors in our country. And we get these names from my colleague, Thomas Frampton, who produced an article that was able to identify who some of these first Black jurors are. And I want to remind us that these first Black jurors are not an indication of Black people becoming qualified to serve on juries. These Black people who are able to serve on juries is actually an indicator of white progress, because Black people were not seen as peers to white people. Remember, our concept of a jury is that you are entitled to a jury of your peers. And so if Black people aren't seen as peers, then they're never going to get the right to serve on a jury. And when I mentioned the 15th Amendment, I want to also remind us that the right to vote was frequently married to the right to serve on a jury. So who would have the right to vote? Well, we've heard of things like literacy tests or poll taxes or grandfather clauses, right? And we've seen instances that once Black people got some political power, right, access to the ballot box, or the civic power, access to the jury box, there were always efforts to curtail that power and restrict that power, right? And some of the names that I want to lift up, right? So we have Andrew Barland, who served on a grand and a petit jury near Natchez, Mississippi in 1820. We have Abner Francis, who served as a petit juror in Buffalo, New York in 1843. And we have John D. Berry, who served as a petit juror in upstate New York in 1855. And Joseph Cox, who was on a petit jury veneer for the trial of Jefferson Davis, right, the president of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia in 1867. Now, there's also two Black men in 1860 that served in Massachusetts by the name of Francis U. Clough and William H. Jenkins. Right. So I want to bring these names into the conversation as we celebrate Black History Month, as we celebrate some pioneers who were accessing the power of the jury box. But remember, these men at that time were not the norm. They were the exception, right? They were highly educated. They were wealthy. They were seen as community leaders who were, quote unquote, worthy and deemed to be able to have access to the power of that jury box. But when we recognize where we are today in 2026, we have to acknowledge who some of those pioneers were serving on those juries. Like imagine serving on a jury, the last name that I mentioned, the one of the names I mentioned was Joseph Cox, who served on a petit jury veneer for the trial of Jefferson Davis. Like, that's a big deal, right? We have the president of the Confederacy potentially being brought up on charges, and there's a black man who's able to serve on that jury. So I just wanted to bring those names into the conversation as we celebrate Black History Month and recognize them accessing the power of the jury box. And Porsha-Shaf'on, I'd love to hear any of your reflections on hearing some of the years and some of the locations where these first Black jurors were able to serve.
I mean, I think about, I feel like we both at the same time mentioned Mr. Jenkins, and it's Mr. Jenkins and I believe his name was Mr. Clow. Mr. Clow. I think about them serving in Massachusetts, right? And I always forever think about Black people in predominantly white states and predominantly white places. And I think about sort of the courage, right? The courage that it must have took to be able to be like, Tim, 2 tears in a bucket, I'm going to do this. I want my presence to be felt. I want my voice to be used. Like this service, this duty is so important to me. I'm willing to risk it all. And it makes me feel proud, at their courage, at their bravery. And I'm really glad, we took the time to recognize, how important the role of jury service, not just is generally, but specifically for and to Black people.
It really is significant. And I think about in this moment, what is a potential call to action, right? Mm-hmm. When I looked at my former, city where I lived when I was in college in Minneapolis, and I think about the community that I was able to tap into while I was there, and talking to one of my line brothers, I'm a proud member of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, and one of my LBs is pastor out, the faith leader, and just hearing from him some of the stories on the ground about how the faith community is coming together, about how the Twin Cities community is coming together in the cold, y'all. Like, you haven't experienced cold until you survived the Minnesota winter, where it's just regularly in the negative digits with the wind chill. But just thinking about what can we be doing in this moment, right? We have these conversations about the power of jury service. We're giving you examples about how our federal government is coming into spaces and committing harm against communities. And then we're wondering, well, what can be done? I just want to end on an idea, right? There are opportunities for state prosecutors to bring charges against federal law enforcement officers. And yes, there is this concept called supremacy clause immunity. And essentially what that means, it recognizes that the supremacy clause establishes that the federal government, if there's a contest between the federal government or federal law and state law, the federal law will reign supreme. And so what that means is that if there are federal law enforcement officers who are enforcing federal law, they can't necessarily be prosecuted with a state law for enforcing a federal law. So what do I mean? Officers that have been in the Twin Cities who are enforcing immigration law, that's a federal law. If they were to be charged with murder of Alex Preddy or Renee Good, or we think about in Los Angeles of Keith Porter, what the federal officer would do is they would file for that case to be removed from state court into federal court. And then the state prosecutor would actually proceed with the case in federal court. And what the federal law enforcement officer would have to do to prove that they have an immunity or that they have that type of a defense is, one, they would have to demonstrate that their actions were authorized by federal law. So the first prong would try to be met by saying we're enforcing federal immigration law. And then the second thing that they would have to demonstrate, which is this is where they're going to have the most difficulty, is that in enforcing this authorized immigration law, that they did not do anything more than what was necessary and proper to enforce that federal immigration law. So the question that could be posed to the members of the jury is, when those officers took out their guns and when they squeezed that trigger and when they fired those bullets and when they killed those people, was that necessary? Was it proper when trying to enforce immigration law? And so we need to be seeing state prosecutors, attorneys general, who are representing people in these states who are disagreeing with the federal enforcement of these immigration laws, to represent their constituents, to object to the presence of the federal government in their communities in this fashion. So there's an opportunity here for you all to reach out to your prosecutors, to reach out to your attorneys general and say, look, we need you all to represent us in this moment because our community is dying, that people are being killed. And if you want to have the conversation about immigration policy, we can have that conversation, but it shouldn't necessarily be coming at the cost of people's lives. So what we want you all to take away with from this conversation is being reminded of the power of your presence, of the value of your voice in that jury box, regardless if it's a grand jury box or if it's a trial jury box or a petite jury box. Because if you're in that grand jury and a prosecutor, a federal prosecutor is presenting you with charges, and these charges are being applied to a person who was out demonstrating and protesting against ICE, guess what you have the power to do? You have the power to say no true bill, no indictment. Or let's say that a case is proceeded past the grand jury and you're now sitting in a trial jury. Guess what you have the power to do? You have the power to vote not guilty. And we need to be taking advantage of these moments and these opportunities for us as people who are being governed to send a message of what is going to be done in our name and what is not going to be done in our name. So that's our call to action. Reach out to your prosecutors, talk about charges that could be brought against federal law enforcement officers who are violating state law. And then, as always, flex that power of the jury box, regardless if it's a grand jury or a trial jury. If you have any questions, let us know. And I'm going to pass it over to Porsha-Shaf'on for her closing thoughts because I've given you mine.
Absolutely. I know that our conversation community has focused a lot on Minneapolis, but I want to be very clear that, since this administration has decided to use the police force and immigration officials as an extension of their agenda, people in other states, community members in other states have already recognized what their power is and what they can do to send our government a message. What you're not going to do is come up in here and treat us any old kind of way. I want to shout out the amazing, amazing community members in Washington, D.C. Since the inception, right, of all of this utter chaos in our most recent administration, the individuals in D.C. have been in these grand juries, returning no true bills, day in and day out, across the country. There are people who are recognizing that the prosecutors and police are essentially extensions of our government's political agenda. And folks are showing up and they are showing out. And for those of us that have fear, we can look to the individuals that are already doing it. So thank you so much for everybody who's already shown up. Keep nullifying. And I want to encourage you, for those of you that are scared or for those of you who don't know what to do, as Mr. Snowden said, go into that jury box and exercise your power to nullify. Send the government a message. Send the government a message.
Thank you for that, Porsha-Shaf'on. And thank you all for joining us for this conversation of our Jury Duty Unmasked. We come and join you all in community and conversations to share some of the perspectives and experience that both Porsha-Shaf'on and I have had as people who've worked inside the criminal legal system as public defenders, as people who have taken upon the charge and the privilege of representing poor people who cannot afford to hire their own attorneys. And we want to be in this fight with you all. So continue to tune in, continue to send us your questions that you might have, and continue to be safe. With that, good night.
Good night, y'all.